All right, not that we showcase ourselves here, but you might have heard me mention once or twice that Fox Business Network is hosting another presidential debate in Charleston, South Carolina in a couple of weeks. And I was thinking, knowing my special guest was going to be Doris Kearns-Goodwin, who, by the way, is pretty good at these presidential biographies. She's like, I encourage her early on, keep writing, Doris, keep writing. And now I discover that was the same city, Charleston, South Carolina, that was home, if memory serves me right, Doris, for the 1860 Republican convention, one that was a brokered convention, save in the end, I think by the third ballot, this guy Abraham Lincoln won. So could lightning strike twice for Republicans who many fear have too many in the race and no mathematical way for a guy or woman to get the delegates necessary to secure a first ballot nomination? What do you think?
Well, you know, it's so interesting you go back to 1860 because my first mind is to go back to 1912 when it was really a troubling thing for the Republican Party that there was an inter-party split. 2 Republicans ran against 1 Democrat, and of course the Democrat won. But you're right, in 1860, before the primary system, delegates went to the convention. They had their favorite guy, and Lincoln wasn't the #1 favorite guy probably of most of the delegates. Seward was, and he knew that if it wasn't Seward, it would be Chase, and if it wasn't Chase, it was going to be Bates. And then he so smartly told the delegates, if you can't have your first love, come to me as the second love. And he hadn't attacked any of the other 3 candidates. So when the ballots all went crazy after the first ballot and they had to decide who to go to, he was the only one who hadn't hurt their man. So there's a lesson in there. And then, of course, we get the greatest president of all time from that brokered convention.
Yeah, I see that. One of the things, too, in the 1912 case, what emerged after that with Teddy Roosevelt splitting the vote with President Taft is that they divided the Republican vote and allowed Woodrow Wilson to get in. But barring that type of scenario here, people look at brokered conventions or the possibility of brokered conventions and say they're always damaging. We know in that example, not the 1912 example, in the 1860 example, it's not always the case. So do you think that there is a likelihood we could be looking at that and then the fallout for Republicans?
Yeah, you know, I think everything is so topsy-turvy this year that I don't think we can simply say, oh, no, if it's not one of those sanitized conventions where everybody loves one another, it's going to end up being terrible, because it also could create even more excitement. I mean, look how troubling in some ways the debates have been. The Republican candidates have been against each other, a rule that Ronald Reagan said, never speak against your own Republican Party, and yet the interest in the debates, the interest in politics has only grown. So I don't know whether it's just part of our culture right now, that desire to see people really fighting each other because there's anxiety out there. So it's conceivable, if it could work itself out, it would mean if somebody gets to a brokered convention that nobody got a majority through the primary system. And given the number of candidates and maybe the number of viable candidates who can keep funding themselves between their own money and the super PACs, it may not be that Iowa and New Hampshire undo the deal as they always have in the past.
You know, I've looked at the math of this because I'm the resident nerd here at Fox. That's just what I do.
It's a good thing to be. And
I was crunching these numbers, and I cannot see a scenario by which one candidate will rise in Cleveland with all the delegates necessary. He or she might have some momentum going, but not enough to close the deal. Now, our recent experience with such conventions, as you know, Doris, is that they're hellish on the party that has to endure them. We think of 1968 with the Democrats, and we go back in time. We think of raucous and how divisive it is. Now, a lot that depends on people kissing and making up after the fact. If it is not a Donald Trump and a consensus candidate emerges, either among the people still running or an establishment figure out there, do you envision everyone kumbayaing after that and moving forward?
Well, it depends on whether or not there really is a consensus candidate. You know, in the old days, the people who would broker the conventions would be the party bosses.
Right.
Because they had control over advertising, they had control over pamphlets, they had control over money. But who are they now? That's the real problem. If you go into a situation and you simply have several factions that are against each other and don't want the other person, who is going to be that magical character who brings them together? I think it's much harder to imagine, but it's not impossible to assume that it might happen somehow, and then we got to figure out what would happen when that happens.
Now, we always talk about passion. In other words, Barack Obama benefited from passionate supporters, some of whom had not voted, but were inclined to vote. Now, we learned that the numbers didn't belie that necessarily with youthful voters, but they certainly did with minorities, et cetera. The argument for Donald Trump, as people posit this, is that whatever he might risk losing with Latino voters and women voters, they argue they're bringing in all these voters who never voted Republican in the past or voted at all, the so-called flannel flyover country that heretofore has not been engaged but will be this year, more than offsetting what he might lose in traditional respects. What do you make of that?
Well, if he could bring together what might have been old Democratic voters, some blue-collar voters, independent voters, who are feeling anxious about the economy of the system, feeling that they want somebody with a contagious optimism. I mean, I think the one thing Trump has had going for him somehow is he's so positive about himself that he almost projects that positivity onto the voters who want somebody who's going to be able to do something. And when he says, make America great again, it's somehow, if you look at the polling, it has established itself. I think the real question for Trump will be, does he have the ground game and the organizational spirit out there to match his polls? If we had a national primary right now among the Republicans, he would be the winner.
Indeed.
But our system still doesn't work that way. I remember when Tip O'Neill, there was a woman in his neighborhood who he thought had been his friend, and he said, well, you voted for me, didn't you? And she said, no, I didn't. And he said, why? Well, you didn't ask me to vote for you. I'm wondering whether in Iowa and New Hampshire, if that ground organization has not been created and he loses both of those states, then will that same optimism that he feels about himself be continued? Will he still be able to get up there with that body language that has persuaded people that he will deal with their problems somehow, despite whatever he says, he will do it? And I think that's the key for him as to whether or not he's done enough work in those two states. You
know, part of that person-to-person contact has been a rap that he's raised against Marco Rubio, that it's a whole new style of politicking that, you know, succeeds. But to hear Chris Christie say, you got to press the flesh, you got to do that. I'm just wondering if it turns out that Donald Trump could succeed not doing that, then it would change the rules for everything, right?
I think it would. I mean, if he succeeds, you know, or if he manages to succeed without winning Iowa, or even without winning in a big way New Hampshire, or even losing that, then everything is upended. Then it is much more of a national situation going on, because then you get all those big states coming down. And it may mean that the power of those two first states will be reduced. But we're still a long way from when those persons go into a booth and they take that lever rather than just answering a poll question. But there's no question, I could not have predicted where we are now. I don't think any of us could. So I think it's easier for me to look back to 1860 than it is to look ahead to 2016.
Yeah, I hear you there. Doris, it's a real pleasure. I hope you have a very safe and happy New Year.
Thank you. Same to you, Neil. Thank you.
Doris Kearns Goodwin. A lot could change in the next few weeks. She's right about that.